The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On November 29th, I rose in this House to address what I think is a disturbing trend happening at the Immigration and Refugee Board, or IRB. The trend appears to be that there are more and more conservative appointments being made to that body, and fewer claims for refugee protection are being accepted. We now have the lowest rate of approvals in Canadian history. Mr. Speaker, I and many MPs have stood in this House to highlight cases where the system appears to have failed, and we've called on the government to act to help an immigrant family or refugee. Invariably, the Minister or Parliamentary Secretary responds that all applicants have gone through our system and we must trust that the system works. They say that the process is fair. They claim the IRB is independent, and they say that our system has several opportunities for appeal. Most importantly, Madam Speaker, when asked if there is anything they can do to prevent a deportation of a particular individual, they often point out that we do not want cases to be decided by the whim of the Minister or to be subject to political interference. Madam Speaker, I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. But political interference is, regrettably, becoming apparent through the system. How are we supposed to have faith in our system when we hear about patronage appointments made to the IRB? When I asked the Minister about patronage appointments when I asked my question in the House, he said that he knew of only 2 appointments that had conservative ties. In less than 24 hours, we were able to find 16 former conservative politicians, former candidates, donors, or advisors to ministers of this government had, in fact, been appointed to the IRB. Now, since November, we have learned of 2 more recent patronage appointments, people appointed to the IRB apparently because of their conservative ties as opposed to their independence or expertise. Worst of all, we have learned that these board members seem to be biased against granting refugee protection. One member who was recently reappointed by this government was reappointed despite granting 0 out of 169 refugee claims that he's heard. Madam Speaker, this would not be so troubling if people's lives were not at stake, but they are. The integrity of the IRB is critical to the integrity of the whole system. If we cannot trust the independence of the IRB, then all the appeal processes in the world don't matter, because what we know about appeals, particularly to the Federal Court of Canada, is that those appeals are not based on the merits of the case. They are not even based on the facts of the case. That appeal process simply determines whether or not the process was followed properly and whether procedural justice and natural justice principles were observed. Madam Speaker, we are told to trust the independence of the system, but we see the Minister introduce Bill C-31, which inserts great potential for political interference into our immigration system. With C-31, we learn that the Minister wants even more power to be concentrated in his office. He has backtracked on a pledge he made to all parties in this House and all Canadians to approach refugee issues with a better sense of fairness and balance. The Minister wants to have the discretion to designate countries, in his opinion, as safe. He wants the sole discretion to determine, by that discretion, who has access to the Refugee Appeal Division. The Minister wants the sole discretion to decide if a refugee's arrival in Canada qualifies as irregular. The Minister wants the power to impose mandatory detention for up to a year on someone whose biggest crime may be thinking that Canada will offer them safety from persecution. Madam Speaker, it is getting harder and harder to take the government's advice to trust the system. How can we, when we see the creeping of political interference and political judgment into a process that should be quasi-judicial and completely free of any kind of partisan hint? Madam Speaker, will the government stop this disturbing trend towards injecting political ideology into our immigration system and return to a commendable record of having an independent IRB and immigration system?
Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague and NDP critic, the member for Vancouver Kingsway. Madam Speaker, I take issue with virtually everything he has said. First of all, with respect to the acceptance rate for asylum claims made at the Immigration Refugee Board, it's actually 38%, which is by far one of the highest rates in the Western world. If you actually look at the acceptance rates for asylum systems in Western liberal democracies like the EU, US, Australia, New Zealand, you'll see that most of them are half as high as ours or lower. Many of them are in the single digits, and so Canada is regarded as having one of the highest acceptance rates. The notion, therefore, that the IRB is arbitrarily rejecting claims unfairly is, I think, manifestly unfair and untrue. Secondly, I think the member honestly misunderstands this, that one of the significant achievements of this government with respect to our asylum system and our immigration system has been cleaning up the appointments process for the IRB. Now, let me explain how we've done this. We've put in place a appointment screening committee that is made up of representatives of the chairman of the IRB, and yes, people appointed by the minister, but first people have to go through a written test. They go through a resume review. They're called in for interviews, and ultimately, another level of testing, ultimately only 10% of the applicants for the IRB are actually recommended to the minister. And the minister, my office, has no role in deciding who is recommended. Only 1 out of every 10 are recommended. Now, since the government came to office, we've appointed or reappointed over 300 individuals to the IRB. Since I've been minister, over 150. Now, I was only aware of 2 that had a connection to the Conservative Party. The member has done research and has said he has included people who ever gave like a one-time donation to even a provincial Conservative Party. He's mentioned candidates who ran for provincial Conservative parties 20 years ago, people I've never heard of, except that they were recommended to me as being fit for the IRB. But even taking his numbers, let's say he's right. Let's say that 18 of these people committed the crime of having at some time been affiliated with the Conservative Party. That's 6% of the more than 300 people that we've appointed, meaning over 94% by his own numbers, Madam Speaker, don't have any demonstrable affiliation with the Conservative Party. And of those that I know that had an affiliation, it's closer to less than 1%. So, Madam Speaker, I reject out of hand this notion that this is I can say with all honesty, that this is not patronage. Now, obviously, if someone is recommended to the minister and they happen to have had some connection to a Conservative Party in the past, I'm not going to exclude them from appointment. That would be ridiculous and unfair. And I can tell the member, I know I've appointed people who've had connections to other political parties, and I would invite the member. I'd be happy to show him the resumes, if the IRB is willing to do this in terms of privacy, the resumes of all the people we've appointed, and he will see the quality of these nominees, Madam Speaker, their involvement in NGOs, many of them in refugee issues, a huge number of them lawyers, I think over half of them women, a tremendous ethnic diversity. We've worked very hard for these quality appointments. This is light years ahead of where we were a few years ago when, frankly, the standard was defeated candidates and spouses of MPs and campaign managers. That's no longer the case. So I agree with them. It's important to maintain the quality, quasi-judicial nature of the IRB, and I believe we're doing just that.
Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Madam Speaker, well, I do want to also thank the minister for being here tonight, and this minister shows his commitment to his department by actually standing in this House and giving his perspective on the matter, and that's commendable. A couple things I would debate with the minister. One thing is that the minister responded to my claim that Canada has the lowest rate in our history of approving refugee claims by comparing us to other countries. Well, that's not what my point is. My point is that compared to previous years of granting refugee status, that right now we're at the lowest stage in the history of Canada. And I noticed that the minister didn't respond to that. He also mentioned that if you took my numbers, if there were 18 appointments to the IRB who had ties to the Conservative Party, and that was what the minister said in the House was he was only aware of 2 people with ties to the Conservative Party, and our research uncovered that there were 18. The minister said that he appointed 150 people in the time he's been minister. That's 12%. 12% of the appointments to this House under this minister's watch have had ties to the Conservative Party. Peter Schouler, the former chair of the IRB, has warned that the appointment process is, in his words, secretive and political. And I'd like the minister or the parliamentary secretary's response, not to my accusation, but to the observations of Peter Schouler, an independent, objective observer.
Parliamentary secretary to the minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker.